This is the 401k Fridays podcast, and I'm your host, Rick Unser. If you're an employer, retirement plan sponsor, or plan fiduciary, and you want to hear candid insights from retirement industry leaders on important trends, topics, and current events, you've come to the right place. Each episode is designed to explore a specific topic and leave our listeners with concrete ideas and strategies to enhance fiduciary protection, streamline plan operations, or improve participant retirement readiness. I'm glad you found us, and here we go with this week's episode. There's been vast improvement by retirement plan fiduciaries when it comes to reviewing plan fees and investments. We even see more retirement plan committees that are checking the box on other important fiduciary tasks. But by accomplishing some of these things, does that mean they have good governance? With that said, what is fiduciary governance? What does good governance look like? And can employers be top-notch fiduciaries, but leave themselves exposed to risk by having poor governance? We tackle this and more today in my conversation with Andy Larson, Director of Retirement Education at the Retirement Learning Center. Right out of the gate, Andy shares what he feels is the key missing ingredient to good governance. We also tackle many common questions we get from employers about governance, such as who should be on a fiduciary committee, how often should you meet, and what should be on your fiduciary to-do list every year. Now listen closely, because some answers you've heard in the past have been updated based on what we've learned from ERISA litigation and other trends. You'll also hear that Andy shares my love for analogies, and there's some good ones today. Before we get started, it's hard for me to wrap my head around this, but we have over 120 episodes in our library now. If you haven't already, be sure to scroll through some of our archives. Most episodes, like this one, are evergreen and don't have a shelf life. If you're already subscribed to the podcast, you can easily scroll through your app, or you can go to 401kfridays.com and find our top 10 most popular episodes on the homepage. Now, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Andy. Well, Andy, thanks for joining me on the podcast today. I am looking forward to our conversation around fiduciary governance.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the chance to chat with you about some of the aspects of it. We found that really it's been sort of surprising to us in that there's been such a focus on fiduciary. To some degree, I think we've lost ground in terms of governance and good governance practice. And in addition to that, I think there's been so much perhaps myopic focus on fees that we've sort of missed the broader discussion in terms of value, and that is, are the services delivered for the costs incurred, is there value there, which is really the ERISA standard. So looking forward to those discussions, because I think there's a lot of applicability here for plan sponsors and practitioners that really needs to be reexamined.
You mentioned a great point, which is kind of where I was thinking it might make sense to start, which is it seems like everyone is just hyper-focused on fees right now, and with that focus on fees, is it the proverbial people are, losing the trees from the forest, or however that expression goes? I think I just butchered it. But, are people so focused on one minute aspect of a portion of what you need to be doing as part of being a fiduciary or part of a fiduciary governance process that the broader focus or the broader conversation of what goes into good governance is being lost?
Absolutely. And I think your question is right at the heart of what I see is a significant concern for plan fiduciaries, and maybe more importantly for plan committees. And that is simply focusing on an element of governance that's nothing more than showing that you have the lowest fees is not what is required by ERISA. And as a result, I think we've actually diminished in terms of our governance process because of the fee, and I'll use the word obsession. And I understand that it's easy to understand, it's easy to articulate lowest fee, But I think we have to be loud and clear to fiduciaries that your duty is not to always identify the lowest fee. The goal is under ERISA to ensure that the plan is being operated in the best interests of the participants. To do that, we need to understand the services being offered. We need to understand the fees being paid. And then the assessment of, is value being driven for the plan participants? That's more work. That's more analysis. That's more thinking than simply a black and white spreadsheet of here's what we're paying and maybe we can save 8 basis points if we do something different. The focus should not be on fees directly. The focus should be on providing value for the participants and what is in their best interest. And I even think meeting notes and committee agenda notes need to reflect this, because that consideration is often absent, at least in the meetings that I participate in.
Yeah, and let me dive in on that. And everything you just said there on, cost and value echoes so strongly with what we've heard from a lot of other podcast guests. Tom Kamak, for example, CEO of Fiduciary Benchmarks. That was a huge theme in his episode where we talked about, fee benchmarking and fee evaluation and making sure to tie those two together. And then the other thing was an early conversation I had on the podcast with Jason Roberts, and I had to look up some of these words, but one of my favorite quotes from him was, cost is not dispositive of prudence. And I had to look that one up, but after I figured out what that meant, I'm like, oh, got it. You can't just, low cost at all cost is not a good fiduciary strategy.
And in fact, I would contend that if one exclusively looks at cost without focusing on the unique needs of that employee group, I contend that one is not and arguably cannot satisfy your fiduciary obligations without an understanding of the group. Because to operate a plan, the gold standard of ERISA, is ensuring that the plan is operated in the best interests of the participants. There's an underlying presumption that the committee is expected to have, that the committee, understand the nature of that group and can operate the plan in that best interests of that group. So in my opinion, unless there's even a periodic discussion at a committee level in terms of what does our group need, what's in their best interest to achieve reasonable retirement outcome, one can't even begin to assess fees, because that's like running to second base without, touching first. What are the needs of that unique group? And I think if the meeting notes, if the committee discussions start there, and at least annually go back to that, I think that's a good foundation then to start assessing fees and, as importantly, assessing services.
Maybe this gives us somewhere to kind of launch from in this broader conversation. What goes into a good fiduciary governance process? And then to the point you just made there, how do you ensure that some of those functions or some of those steps in a fiduciary governance process tie to what's in the best interest of your plan participants?
Yeah, that's the the million or billion dollar question. And before I answer that question, I want to back up just a bit and talk about the difference between focusing on fiduciary versus focusing on governance. And focusing on fiduciary is like you're coaching or managing a baseball team. And you practice with the catchers and you work with the pitchers and you work with the first baseman, but you never get everybody out on the field practicing together. I've seen plans that have good fiduciaries and good fiduciary processes, but within a terrible governance strategy. So, number one, to have a good governance strategy, this might sound a little silly, but it's accurate, is you should have a governance strategy. When do you meet? Who is on the committees? Why are those people on the committees? Who's in charge of setting the agendas? Who's in charge of compiling the packets? Who's in charge of compiling the minutes and disseminating the minutes? Unfortunately, many plan committees, as they have retained various fiduciaries, whether it's a 321 or a 338 fiduciary, many committees have actually sort of backed off their good governance in terms of documentation and analysis, thinking that one or more of their retained fiduciaries are now responsible for those functions. And the reality is they typically are not. So step one in a good governance process is understanding what your vendors are, but maybe more importantly, understanding what they're not going to be doing.
I loved your kind of, that team analogy where you can have some of the best and brightest people, whether they be maybe internally or externally, serving as a fiduciary to your plan. But if you're not working together as a team, then it's kind of all for naught. Without naming names, are there maybe one or two examples that you could share, or just one or two for instances that you could share for employers that might go, oh yeah, okay, got it. Yeah, that I'm with you there. That's that's kind of sounds like us, or or that sounds like a friend of mine who's who's on the committee.
Yeah, I have this friend that, and we see that a lot. And the biggest, and if I can get tactical, the biggest mistake that I see committees making in terms of governance is, as I alluded to earlier, is the assumption that some other party are doing or is doing some of these steps. And let me just tactically give you some illustrations. It's not uncommon to one or more vendors or one of the more fiduciaries to provide the committee with the benchmarking information. Well, it is frequent that I see that benchmarking information in the plan file. But what I don't see is the corresponding compilation of, okay, here's the services that we're getting for those fees. And then most importantly, missing the documentation of the analysis. And that's the key here, analysis of, gee, we paid X, we received services Y. Our analysis is that this is or is not reasonable. That is what ERISA expects of you. So to use a baseball analogy again, the first base would be to determine what the fees are. Second base is determining what services you're receiving for those fees. Third base is the analysis to determine value, and home plate, when you finish running your bases, is you're either getting value and you can continue present course and speed, or you're not getting value and you need to find ways to lower costs or get additional services. So what I frequently tell committees is they're not running the bases. A lot of them are stopped at second base. They stop, they get the benchmarking information. Oh, we've done our due diligence, and they stop there. So what I admonish committees to do tactically is run the basis, assess services, assess fees, do the analysis, and lastly, make a determination. And that's what, if, for example, if a plan is investigated by the Department of Labor, which is becoming more ubiquitous, that's what labor is going to look for. They're going to look for your analysis in your committee notes, in your committee records. And if they see analysis, they are a lot less curious. They're a lot less willing to dig deeper. And that's one of the big areas I see missing in the governance process right now.
So a lot of paper in the files, but maybe not so much tied to how that paper is helping fiduciaries make decisions in the best interest of their plan participants.
Exactly. A lot of paper in the file isn't going to help you unless there's documentation that your committee is actually doing assessment and analysis. And the good news is, if you look at ERISA litigation, where there is a governance process, where there is documentation, where there is analysis, judges rarely second guess plan committees. They want to make sure, though, there is a process and there's analysis in the documentation. So it behooves you from a liability perspective to have that analysis in the file.
You're doing such a good job with analogies here. So let me just let's keep going down that path. You know, as someone is either evaluating their current fiduciary governance process, or as they are establishing one for the first time, whether it's, hey, I got it, we need to do this, so I'm ready to go. What should I do? Or, you know, we're looking to improve. Is there an analogy, or is there a story, or is there just maybe a kind of a quick overview that you would recommend, just from a process standpoint? Here's where you start, and here's where you want to get to. You gave us some great info on the fee side of things, but I think that's a part of a bigger narrative around what people need to be doing to truly have good governance on their retirement plan.
Exactly. And I guess where I encourage committees to start. Let's give you an example. There was a group we dealt with down in the Southeast, and they realized that they hadn't been doing much. Very, very tactically talk baby steps. Take your committee, get your plan documents, your adoption agreements, and go through key provisions. Understand how that plan works. Now, that doesn't mean you have to read every page, but you should have a general understanding of what provisions are in that plan.
Let me push back on there for a second. So that to me sounds like plan design. You know, plan design, I've always heard, is a settler function. Is it a fiduciary responsibility to understand necessarily how the plan is designed?
Very good observation. And in looking at plan provisions, there clearly is a settler function attendant in that. Absolutely. And I think that's where we can sort of get double mileage out of this process. And first, let me talk settler function. And secondly, I'll talk administration. Many, many, many times we find committees are completely unfamiliar with plan provisions. Now, what happens then is, how do we know that that plan is still meeting the needs of that plan sponsor? And when the committee identifies provisions that maybe made sense in the past, currently don't make sense today, that's part of the role of the committee, I think, is to bring that up to the board and make recommendations. Look, we're doing this way now, but now we acquired this new unit, and it changed the dynamic. Maybe we should be making some plan amendments. So I think there is a settler dimension to that. I don't think that's an ERISA mandate, but ultimately, I think it's good for the participants, because if the plan is continuing to meet the needs of the corporation, support for that plan and the costs will improve at the C-suite level. So that's the settler side. More importantly, on the ERISA side, I think plan committees need to have a general understanding of the details, because under ERISA, one of the key tenets of ERISA is that you must operate the plan in accordance with the plan document. If you don't, that is tantamount to not following the ERISA law and ERISA regulation. So how can a committee operate a plan if it doesn't know what the provisions are? So to me, that's absolute, to go back to my baseball analogy, absolute first base at a strategic corporate level is the committee should be facile with what the plan provisions are, and then the committee should be asking themselves the question, and their service providers and their payroll department and even their IT department and their benefits department, how do we know the plan is being operated in accordance with its provisions? And that's something, another strategic piece that I would dare say the majority of committees have been remiss in their governance.
And I'm not being argumentative here, but I totally agree with all of that. I think one thing that I know some committees are challenged with is, you've got some very busy people that you're tapping into, especially at larger organizations. You're tapping into a CFO, you're tapping into a general counsel, you're tapping into a, senior HR leader, someone in operations, finance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, help me help them here. You've got these very busy people coming into a room, and I think the impression some might have is, hey, sitting down and talking about plan provisions, I don't know. Is that the best use, or is that a good use of some time of some very busy senior executives?
The question really speaks to the composition of the plan committee. And my view is being busy doesn't give a pass on the ERISA requirements. So what I'm seeing anecdotally is membership in plan committees is to some degree, I think, being shifted a bit downstream, maybe away from the C-suite, or with limited C-suite involvement, or the usage of subcommittees with individuals more facile with the day-to-day, able to do that level of analysis and then report up to maybe the senior committee, which is maybe made up of more C-suite members, saying, yes, we have reviewed plan provisions. We have then gone to the record keeper and had them certify that our plan provisions are consistent with how they've got the plan set up. So I'm not at all recommending that the C-suite folks, read the plan document, but they need to do proper delegation, and that's as much good governance as anything else. And the good news is there are individuals using service providers appropriately that they can do a lot of this legwork. Now, when you're using a service provider to do some of this work, there's always a concern about conflict of interest. But I would challenge committees then in terms of who's on the committee. Could there be subcommittees? Who could be doing some of the legwork such that it could be then rolled up at a more strategic level for the senior committee members?
And you kind of dovetailed me to one of my questions. And again, hopefully I'm not taking you too far off track here, but I mean, the inevitable question we get, when we're talking to clients or other folks about fiduciary governance, about just the process of overseeing your plan, who should sit on a committee, how frequently should the committee meet, all of those kind of basic tactical questions. I'm sure you get them as well. So what are your thoughts, or how would you kind of help someone think about those questions of membership and frequency?
The question of how do you start working with a committee in terms of who should be on the committee, what should be done in what time frame. And that's something that I know a lot of committees really wrestle with. But let me give you an idea that I use with committees that have that as a concern. What I start with is I've got a laundry list of many different governance tasks that maybe the committee should be involved with. And not every committee needs to be, every task. As an example, employer securities related issues, a lot of plans don't have employer security, so we can throw that one out. But step one is we work with the committee to identify, okay, here's what we all agree should be done on an annual basis. Everybody agrees. Then we have a candid discussion of what is not being done. In other words, where are the gaps? Then we ask the question, who could we get, who could be involved to help fill the gaps? Who could be doing some of this legwork? And we identify individuals, and maybe they're service providers, maybe they're consultants, oftentimes they're employees in maybe the benefits area, maybe the payroll area, etc. But we identify possible resources to help fill these gaps. Then we ask ourselves, we go through each of the elements in the master calendar, how often do these specific items have to be addressed? Maybe quarterly, maybe semi-annually. A lot of issues are only annual. So then we step back and say, okay, here's our committee structure. Are there additional people we should be bringing on the committee? Or are some of these individuals we previously identified can just be sort of ad hoc? They show up maybe once a year and make their presentation to the committee. The committee then takes action where applicable. Or maybe we set up subcommittees. But I think the first step is identifying what should be done, candidly assessing what hasn't been done, identify the resources then to sort of backfill, and then create that calendar and the timeline and the frequency. That process I've found to be acceptable to committees, understandable, and it seems to work.
Do you guys have a document, a calendar, a template of questions or tasks that a committee should be doing that we could post or put up in the show notes?
Sure. The question is, what should be on this master list? And in fact, we're in the process of rolling out a new book called the Plan Governance Resource Guide. And one of the elements in the book is precisely that. And that is a laundry list of, here's all the potential committee agenda items over a 12-month period. So we have that available. In addition, most plans probably have something similar available, and they don't even realize it, and that is virtually all record keepers have a library of governance and fiduciary documents, and most have that checklist available also through the record keeper. So the information's out there. It's just uncovering it and implementing it or using it in the day-to-day process.
So we've got the laundry list. We've got kind of the some thoughts there on what needs to be taken care of, maybe how frequently things need to be taken care of. And as people start to move to, all right, now who should be on the committee, I'd love to get some of your thoughts there. And I'd also love if you can share a little bit about your observation earlier for, you're seeing some committee members maybe go down a rung outside the C-suite, and then also how you would see sort of the structure of maybe a subcommittee or a committee that's formed for a specific task, how that interlinks or meshes with kind of maybe a broader retirement plan committee.
Sure. When I talk committees, what I try not to do right away is talk. I don't like to focus on individuals. I like to focus on skill sets. Mm-hmm. for example, one skill set that's nice to have on the committee is kind of a legal or paralegal background. That will certainly help with interpretation issues. Another person that's good to have on the committee is someone with an accounting background and or a finance background. Because of the sort of the interconnectedness of the plan and HR and benefits, I think it's important to have a person involved that has an HR and or benefits background. More and more, as I'm hearing, especially on larger plans, concerned about cybersecurity, data security in general. In some cases, we're even seeing IT people involved there. Another committee member that's maybe a little more controversial is I'm generally an advocate of having an employee representative on the committee, representing the employee group or multiple employee representatives, representing different employee stakeholder groups. Just as an anecdote, we'd worked with a team in upstate New York. It wasn't a large plan, maybe 300-400 lives, but there was one employee that was just their gadfly, challenging everything, questioning everything. This employee was the one hanging around the water cooler, starting all the rumors that the plan money was going to be stolen and the plan investment committee were crooks, and this guy was the pot stirrer. Well, in the process of his pot stirring, he did spend a lot of time reading and understanding the plan. So I advocated for, and the committee actually made that individual an ad hoc member of the committee. And now that individual was sort of on the inside, became the biggest advocate for the plan. And they ultimately made that individual a full-time or a full-fledged committee member. And frankly, that individual became the biggest advocate for the plan within that whole corporation. My experience is I think we want to involve the employee groups also, and that can be real insightful and very helpful to sell changes and modifications to the plan throughout the organization.
So 2 observations based on what you just said. One, you didn't mention anything about needing investment skills to be on a committee. So I think that might be a little surprising to some, is that I know that's, I think, a perception that a lot of people have is that we'd want to stock our committee with people that understand investments. So I'd love for you to address that one. And then, I love the idea of having ad hoc employees on the committee. We get asked that a lot. To your point, I've had similar experiences where you have, I don't know that I've taken someone who's been a vocal opponent and put them, had them on the plan, but certainly when you have an employee representative and they see the work that a lot of good committees are doing, man, they're hard pressed to go back and say we've got a bad plan when they see the work and the effort that goes into overseeing a retirement plan. So I guess my long-winded comment there would be, one question we do get when we bring employees onto a committee is, are they or are they not a fiduciary, and how do we set that up correctly so that we're not necessarily putting that employee in quote-unquote harm's way in being a fiduciary when maybe that's not really what would be good for them in the grander scheme, is to have, that fiduciary responsibility, have their personal, assets, et cetera, potentially exposed from a fiduciary liability standpoint. So that was a lot there.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point on the fiduciary. The reality is I'm sort of a heretic when it comes to, is this person or that person a fiduciary? And here's why. If you look at how ERISA litigation occurs, the plaintiff's attorneys name every single party they can possibly name to the lawsuit to get as many pockets available to pick if they prevail. So whether someone is or isn't a fiduciary really doesn't matter, because they're going to be named as one anyway. and you can file a motion for summary judgment and ask to be removed as a fiduciary. But before a judge rules on that motion, they have to conduct sort of a little miniature trial to figure out whether you are or aren't a fiduciary, and those are, that's expensive. So the two ways is, number one, don't make them a voting committee member, or number two, have them on the committee. But more and more committees are now becoming aware of the potential for personal liability, and they oftentimes we're now seeing corporations providing fiduciary liability insurance, which is, I think, sort of becoming more of a mainstream type of a policy.
And I know I asked a really long question, and the first part of my question was, do you need investment experience to be on a committee and a fiduciary to a workplace retirement plan?
I love that question. And here's my concern about packing the committee with investment people. It's the old saying, and everyone's heard it, if you're a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. And I've seen committees that all have investment information, investment skill set or background, and that's all they focus on. And that's, I'm not saying you don't focus on the investments, you certainly need to, but that's where I contend we should be using service providers and vendors to provide strategic level information to knowledgeable committee members. And yes, it's good to have one committee member that has a good understanding of investments, but I contend it's more important to have a committee member that understands how the fees and charges relate and interact with regard to a plan investment. Just being good with investments doesn't mean you understand the fees attendant with that kind of investment. So yes, I think it's important that there be a committee member. That's the point with regard to investment-related recommendations. But if the committee is doing too much legwork on that, they're not making their advisors, their consultants, their service providers do enough of the lifting.
I appreciate you sharing that, because I do think that as some people are sitting back and saying, all right, how are we going to construct this committee? That is a certain gating item that a lot of people think about is, is this person familiar or comfortable with investments? Or, hey, maybe I should be on the committee, and maybe I, being an HR or, someone else that's been tasked with kind of putting all this together. And sometimes there's not that comfort level that they're going to be able to add value, or maybe they shouldn't be on the committee because they're not familiar with investments. And, just to drive this point home, I think you're saying otherwise, that there's plenty of opportunities to add value despite maybe not being the most versed in standard deviation, alpha, or, Sharpe ratios, et cetera.
Absolutely. And I will contend that if we're talking Sharpe ratios and alpha extensively at a committee level, that's probably a symptom of a cumbersome governance process. That should be at a subcommittee level and brought to a committee level at a high level. Again, you don't have to be an expert on something to have some common sense if it can be explained to you correctly. And if you're an investment expert and can't explain things at the level of a committee, your expertise does no good.
So let me pick up on that here. So we've got, we've kind of taken an inventory of all the tasks that need to be done. We've figured out how frequently we're going to do them. We have appointed people that will help accomplish that, whether that be internally or externally. So we're the horse has kind of started to leave the gate. Sorry to mix analogies here. Now we're on to horse racing. Where do people stumble? Where do they make mistakes? You just gave us a good one of, hey, if you're talking about Sharpe ratios, you've probably got that's probably symptomatic of a bad governance process. Where do people, with the best intentions, start going down the wrong path as it relates to getting their fiduciary governance process in place, up and running, et cetera?
The biggest mistake that I see is sort of not going, I'll use a double negative here. Instead of not going down the wrong path, the first mistake I see is they are simply inert. They're not going down any path. They're simply collecting reports from service providers, putting them in the plan file, getting an investment report with little green or red or yellow indicators, and they've been trained sort of like Pavlov's dog to know, if the indicator is red, we better get rid of it. Mini committee, that's all they're doing, and that's all but inert. On the other side of the coin, the mistake I see is too much focus on just investments and or just focusing on fees without focusing on what does the plan say. Are we operating the plan accordingly? Have we amended the plan timely? Are we remitting payrolls timely? When was the last time we did an audit of the compensation files that are being sent to the record keeper via what's required to be sent under the contract? Even things that tactical. But to summarize, the biggest mistake is they are inert. The second is they're so thick in the investment weeds, they're not seeing the forest through the investment weeds, to mix up another analogy.
Yeah, we're good at that today.
That seems to be our specialty.
One other thing that I get asked a lot, or I hear from various industry sources, is, you need an investment policy statement. Now I hear people saying you need a fee policy statement, you need an education policy statement, you need a retirement policy statement. As I think about governance, I feel like having some of those core documents are part of creating a governance process. What's your thoughts on some of those various policy statements? Do they help? Do they add value? Are they a hindrance? Are they a trap that fiduciaries can fall into? What do you think as you hear some of those different examples?
Another one of my favorite questions. And do we need this policy, that policy, or the other policy is I think really the wrong question. Because ideally, what a policy does is simplify things for a committee. If some issue continuously comes up and you find yourself sitting around the table saying, that came up last year, what did we decide? We talked about that a couple of years ago. What did we decide? That's what the policy is for. And where there's consistent discussion year after year, yeah, that might make some sense to create a policy. And that doesn't mean it's going to be 41 pages. Most of the plan policies that I see that are actually utilized are just a page or two. For example, I've seen some problems with plan committees where they make decisions and the decision is decided on a majority vote, but it wasn't a majority vote of all the committee members, some of whom were absent. So the question then is, does it have to be a majority of all committee members or just a majority present? So what's the policy in terms of voting? And that's where consistency should be good. An educational policy for organizations that are focused and really interested in the employee group genuinely understanding the plan, genuinely getting positive retirement outcomes, then I think to hold themselves to a higher standard, to create an educational policy, and then use that as sort of a benchmarking tool to make sure they're adhering to it. So I don't believe in policies just to have them. I believe in policies as a tool to expedite the work of a committee and to help with that documentation to shore up your liability containment strategy.
And similar but different, is there a need for a committee charter to have good fiduciary governance?
And the answer there is maybe, because there already probably is a committee charter, and I've seen committees operate with a charter and never knew they had one. And that is, before we have a committee charter, keep in mind my earlier comment that job one of the committee is to make sure the plan is operated in accordance with the plan document. So before one creates a committee charter, which among other things would, have rules as to voting and majorities and whatnot, but there may already be one contained in the plan document, in the governance section of the plan document. So step one is take a look at what's in the governance section of the plan document. If there are gaps in that, which there often are, a committee charter is a good way to fill those gaps. But the worst thing we can do is create a committee charter that is inconsistent with the plan document. So I'm fine with committee charters. I think they make sense as long as they're consistent with the plan.
In the broader fiduciary governance narrative, process, conversation, what haven't we talked about yet that would be good for employers to know, or any myths or things that you hear out in the marketplace that you wish weren't, things that people heard or paid attention to? What comes to mind?
Probably for me, the biggest one, and we're going to go back to an earlier topic, but take it down a different rabbit hole, is the question of fees. And here's the common misunderstanding. If you see a television program, you hear on the radio, you read something about plan fees and participants are paying too much fees, the fees are too high, and a lot of nasty organizations are charging too much. The reality is, the dirty little secret is, by and large, for most participants in most plans, if they are paying too high of fees, that is in fact a self-inflicted wound, because the bulk of the fees participants pay are derived from the underlying investments that participant select. And if a participant is in an investment that's costing them 200 basis points, and there's an investment available that's costing them 18 investment points, and they don't like the 200, well, they are free in most cases to charge the 18 base, or to select the 18 basis point investment. So by and large, the one myth I'd love to shatter is that if someone's paying high fees, it's a result of some nefarious activity on the part of the plan committee or one of the service providers. Paying too high of fees in almost every case is a self-inflicted wound. And participants we need to double down on participant education to get this point across to them.
And I think in this day and age, certainly as well, I mean, I've seen a ton of investment lineups over the years, and to your point, very few these days seem to have no exposure to lower cost or, passively managed investments. And no, I think that's a good point is, hey, it's out there on your lineup. With a little bit of research and with a little bit of effort, you can probably find an option that's, maybe a little better priced than one that you might think is too highly priced.
Yes, absolutely.
The other thing that I've been talking a little bit about, and I had a great conversation with Ed Murphy the other day at Empower, is, the reality here around fees as well is, these 401ks, they're not free, and there's a lot of hoops and hurdles and compliance requirements and liability and risk that goes along with running a 401k plan, whether it's at the employer level and issues they can run into with lawsuits or the Department of Labor or the IRS, at the provider level, what they need to be doing to run a compliant plan. And, it's not the same as an IRA or even a brokerage account for participants. So I think one other thing that, to your point, that I'd love to see get a little bit more conversation in the broader media is, a 401k plan is not just a low cost index option that people should be able to pay 2, 3, or 4 basis points and call it a day. There's a lot more that goes into running a successful and compliant 401k plan than just providing access to super cheap investment options.
And I just think that's such a great sort of capsulization of especially our initial discussion, that there's a lot more to the 401k. There's a lot of moving parts, a lot of benefits that just can't be had in a 3 basis point index fund alone.
I'm with you. Andy, you've shared a ton of great information, and I know that you are part of the Retirement Learning Center. What is that? Is that something employers can tap into? Are there resources that, if they've liked some of the stuff you've shared today, that they could find, online, or where can they hear more from you or some of the work you guys are doing at the Retirement Learning Center?
Well, thanks for asking. The Retirement Learning Center is we'd like to think of ourselves as really a premier retirement ERISA resource for not only plan sponsors, but consultants, advisors, and even institutional organizations. We've got a very experienced staff. We've got a hotline that can help with virtually any retirement-related issue, from defined benefit funding to deferred comp plans. We do white papers. We have publications. We speak all over the country. We do one-on-one consulting with advisory teams, with plan sponsors, even institutional organizations. Not only compliance, but also on marketing and positioning issues. And our website is retirementlc.com if you'd like more information or want to get a hold of us.
Awesome. Thank you. And I know you and I were all over the map. We used multiple analogies and metaphors, whether it be baseball or horse racing or trees and forests. How do you kind of put a rope around the fiduciary governance conversation here? And, what would you want people to kind of take away from the conversation we had today?
I guess to bring it back down to earth is for a committee to get together and assume they're not doing things right and ask themselves, what should we be doing, ignoring what we think we've been doing correct in the past, just to do an assessment, a kind of a real candid assessment of maybe we should be doing this, what hasn't been done, and really identify what should we be doing that maybe we haven't. Once that's the case, you're halfway there. There are resources available. There's additional staff people, employees, consultants available to support. I think awareness is number one.
Yeah, and I really liked what you said earlier too about, not just papering your file, but really looking at that and tying that analysis to decisions you're making and how those are in the best interest of your plan participants.
That's the standard we're held to.
No, well said. And I think that is another one of those messages that I think, just with as busy as everybody is and with as focused as people are on certain steps or processes or things that they need to be doing, I think that's a great reminder that you gave everybody of, the importance of making sure that it all ties to what's in the best interest of plan participants. Yes.
As long as you're focused on that, I think we'll win.
Andy, thank you for joining me. Thanks for taking the time and sharing your insight. Really enjoyed the conversation. Feel like I learned a lot, which is always a good thing. And certainly, as we tackle this down the road, would love to have you back.
That would be fun. You asked some of my favorite questions, and I appreciate the chance to opine on them. Have a good week.
Excellent. You as well. Well, that was Andy Larson with an O, of the Retirement Learning Center. Great insights on fiduciary governance. And hey, it's been a little while since we tackled the topic, so I was glad to have him on to help us explore. On a side note, as I was trying to come up with a title for this one, we were originally thinking it might be Are You Playing Fiduciary Chess or Checkers? But anyways, it didn't quite seem to fit after we actually had our conversation. So, hey, pivoted a little bit there. But anywho, hopefully you took some good points away from our conversation today around how you can potentially be a good fiduciary, but still have bad governance. If you like this episode, don't forget we have over 120 episodes now in our episode archive. You can easily scroll through and find those on your podcast app on your mobile device, or just go to 401kfridays.com and scroll down on the homepage a little bit, and we have our top 10 episodes. If you're new to the podcast, we have that because I'm a podcast listener, and when people recommend podcasts to me, I was like, well, where do I start? What's a good episode to listen to, or what are a few good episodes to listen to kind of get my arms around what the podcast is all about? So we tried to do that by posting those on the homepage. That way you can see what others have found to be some of the more popular and helpful episodes, and hopefully that gives you a good flavor for what we do here. With that said, thank you for listening, and until next time, I hope you make your Friday a 401k Friday. And now, for some disclosures. The content in this podcast is provided for educational and discussion purposes only. Investing involves risk, including a potential loss of investment. Lockton does not and cannot guarantee the future performance or specific level of performance, the success of any investment, or success of any strategy. Nothing contained herein may be construed as investment or legal advice.